Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello and welcome back to Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast where we look beyond the famous raids and familiar aircraft to explore the wider story of air power, how it evolves, how it's used, and sometimes how it quietly changes the world without ever firing a shot. And of course, RAF Bomber Command wasn't just a creature of the Second World War. Today, we're stepping into a period that often gets treated as a single frozen moment in history, the Cold War. In reality, it lasted nearly half a century, changed constantly and reshaped aviation more profoundly than any other era before or since. This was a time of extraordinary technological acceleration. Jet engines, radar, electronic warfare, nuclear weapons, and aircraft programs so expensive and politically loaded that entire national strategies were built around them. At the centre of all of this sits one category of aircraft, the bomber. From post-war piston aircraft, still rooted in Second World War thinking, to elegant swept-wing jets, to supersonic designs that promised everything and actually delivered very little, Cold War bombers tell us a huge amount about how nations thought war might be fought, even when it never actually was. Now, just before I introduce our guest, I'm delighted to say that James is back with us again this week. How are you, James? Good to see you.
Good to be here. Yeah, I'm absolutely buzzing for this episode. So, growing up, obviously, I loved the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight and all the aircraft that you would expect at air shows. But the Vulcan was always a highlight for me. And I have to say that my phone background is actually, I'll hold this up for those present, an English Electric Lightning, which I've got a massive soft spot for as well. So I'm buzzing to talk some Cold War. And it is a reminder that Bomber Command were about until 1968. So there is a lot to cover here and in future episodes as well. What have I been up to? Well, I'm good. Having a bit of a break in between a PhD submission and my meeting coming up. So prepping for that. Also prepping for a couple of talks, including at the Battle of Britain bunker. I'm talking about the Battle of Britain on screen, films and TV productions. That's the 21st of March at former RAF Uxbridge. So really, really excited about that. I'm also on the For You, the War is Over pod coming up very, very soon. Talking about POWs and the Great Escape. And some exciting news started at Wolverhampton. Again, doing some lecturing there on the strategic bombing course. Sticking to the Second World War. But we have to move on. We do have a guest waiting in the wings. And really to help us make sense of the Cold War and the story, I am delighted to welcome this week's guest. This is joining us from Colorado and someone who spent a great deal of time thinking about bombers, not just as machines, but as strategic and political tools. We have Joe Wilding. Welcome to Never Mind the Dambusters. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me. I'm quite excited that you all asked me to come on and talk about this topic, something I'm somewhat passionate about, and looking forward to it.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and talk a little bit about your background and such like?
Yeah, so I'm an aerospace engineer, and I like to say a certified airplane nerd. I love all things related to aviation. Most of my career has been in new aircraft development, and mostly on the civil side, so business aircraft, a few airliner concepts and stuff like that. I have worked a little bit in the military world, mostly on UAVs. Of various sizes and missions and so forth. And in fact, I just started a new project about a month ago, working on a new advanced military UAV. So kind of exciting.
Wow.
Some of the things I'm working on now and how it kind of ties into some of the stuff we're going to talk about. I can't really talk about what I'm working on, but it's interesting nonetheless. So
that is so cool. So cool.
And then, and on top of, love of aviation, I'm also just a big history nerd. And for me, when history and aviation overlap, that's like the sweet spot of my personal Venn diagrams. Yeah, I love aviation history on all fronts. But I also think that's really what's drawn me to fascination with World War II and the Cold War both, because there's so much going on in aviation in both of those wars. That is, if that's what you're into, it's hard not to get sucked into it.
That's so true. Well, it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us. And this is one of those topics where the deeper you go, the more you realise that the Cold War was really a series of overlapping reactions rather than set plans. And bombers, of course, sit right in the heart of this, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't talk about the Cold War without bombers. And part of it, we'll get into more details here in a second, but part of it is bombers was one of the most consistent parts of the Cold War from very beginning to very end.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about the aircraft, we should probably, start tackling the phrase itself. People talk about the Cold War as if it's one thing, but really it isn't. So, Joe, when does the Cold War actually begin? When does it end? And why is it a mistake to treat it as a single uniform period? Let's start with an easy question first, shall we?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue the Cold War was kind of already going at the end of World War II, but most people, if you were to put a date on it, point to more like around 1947, so a couple of years after World War II. And there was a few things, the Truman Doctrine, that was about trying to prevent the spread of communism in Europe, the Marshall Plan, which kind of doubled down on that by investing money in countries so they didn't just get overrun by the communists. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, what later became the Iron Curtain speech, where he coined that term, that a lot of people point to that. A little interesting side note on that speech he gave was in the middle of Missouri in America. I grew up about 30 minutes from where he gave that speech, which is kind of neat.
Wow.
Before my time, of course, but yeah, and there's a great little Churchill museum on that site now if you're ever in that part of the country. And then the Berlin blockade was another one. So all those are happening kind of in that late 40s period. So that's kind of, what most people say is the start. And then it goes up through it's hard to put an end date on it exactly, but early 90s. So fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of communism, Eastern Europe, and then eventually the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 91. So you subtract those two and you get 45 years. Which, but for reference is twice the time between World War I and World War II. So it's a long period. And then, from there, most people kind of roughly recognize those dates, but it's hard to think about what actually happened in those 45 years. Because I think a lot of people have just a vision of, this is what comes to mind when I think of the Cold War. It's bombers and it's duck and cover drills maybe, and it's missiles and submarines and the movies we associate with and things like that. But all those things, you blend them together, like they didn't all occur at the same time for the most part. So I like to think through like the big milestones of the war and like when did certain things come online and when did all this evolution really happen? So, one of the first ones at the end of the war, America was the only country with atomic weapons. And that held for about 4 years until 1949 when Soviets developed their first bomb. Practically, though, our monopoly on nuclear weapons really lasted a few more years than that. And when I say practically, because even though Soviets detonated a bomb, they didn't have them deployable yet. So it was really early 50s before, what we see is like the actual arms race really heating up. And then mutually assured destruction, another term you get thrown around a lot, is kind of when all the countries involved, and Great Britain had a bomb very soon after that as well. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But the idea of mutually assured destruction or nuclear Armageddon, whatever you want to call it, really didn't heat up until like the mid 50s when the hydrogen bomb came about and when the stockpiles and the number of weapons all these countries had was so great that if World War III ever broke out, literally every major city in Soviet Union, America, Great Britain, et cetera, would probably no longer exist. There was a long period of Cold War that existed before any of those things I just mentioned ever got to that state. Another one that, again, I think is fascinating to think about is we refer to this term called the nuclear triad, which is the ways that nuclear weapons can be delivered. And so for the first 15 years of the Cold War, that was bombers. That was the only way you could deliver a nuclear weapon. So ballistic missiles was the next big change, and whether they're land-based ICBMs or submarine launched, that didn't come about until like the very late and really 60s is early 60s is when that really became developed with enough numbers where it was really effective. So a third of the Cold War, we like to think of missiles and submarines and all of that. Like the first third of the Cold War, that did not exist. It was in development, but it wasn't operational. And really, so there's that famous quote, "The bomb will always get through," which was during World War II. I like to think of this next period, like starting in the early 60s, once you had the nuclear triad, the bomb will always get through. This really good.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point was, all of these offenses are somewhat defeatable in various ways. And if you have multiple ways of doing it, you're probably not going to defeat all of them. And that's really what the arms race and deterrence was all about.
Yeah.
And then the final one on this topic that also was a very much of a change, and it had huge changes on strategy and tactics, specifically related to the bombers, is anti-aircraft missiles. So surface missiles. Those also did not exist in a practical form until the late 50s. So once again, the first 15 years of the Cold War, you didn't really have missile defenses against bombers. So we'll talk more in detail about that when we get some specific bombers, but that was a big change. And so, yeah, all these things, all these dates that these things come in make a big difference on the strategies, the tactics, the weapons themselves, and how all of this was evolving. And I think there's always been a little bit of vagueness on this topic of what is a bomber. And so I think at its simplest definitions, a bomber is an aircraft that drops bombs, right? And so traditionally, your bombers, starting all the way back in World War I, typically when you're larger aircraft that could carry more payload, they typically, because of that, were slower. Range was an important thing, so they often had longer range. And oftentimes they would have defensive aspects, just to protect their own survival, because being slow and large, they are somewhat vulnerable to being shot down. If you go back to World War II, which of course was when heavy bombing and strategic bombing really came to the forefront, you've had a very definition evolved between strategic bombing and tactical bombing. And that became pretty clear, not just in how they were performed, but in the types of aircraft involved. So strategic bombing typically was going against either industrial targets or toward, middle to the end of the war against just population centers themselves. So you were really trying to affect the whole country's ability to make war at the end of the war. Tactical, on the other hand, usually is defined as in support of the army, essentially, on the ground. So you're going after smaller targets, maybe closer range targets, so bridges, rail yards, sometimes armies themselves, and so forth. So that was a kind of a clear distinction in World War II. Then, of course, you could bring fighters into it. So if you take a Mustang or a Typhoon and you put bombs over the wing, is that now a bomber? And it's like, sure, on that mission, you could call that a bomber for sure.
Yeah.
But, those, when you're putting bombs on fighters in World War II, typically it was just a couple small bombs, probably pretty short range. So very different than what a strategic bomber or heavy bomber could do. Then you flash forward to the Cold War, and all of a sudden with nuclear weapons, you now have a single bomb that can be carried, nowadays by something like an F-35 or a F-15 or an F-16 that literally has as much destructive power as like all of the bombs dropped in Europe in World War II. In a single aircraft, a single mission, you can do that. So now all of a sudden, that old definition of, a fighter can only carry a couple little bombs and probably really short distance. Yeah, it's pretty effective weapon. Then, of course, when you get to your larger bombers, you can do that times 10 or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. And I would say as the Cold War evolved, we certainly still have large bombers, but I would say a lot of the missions have gotten kind of what would be called tactical previously, although those missions aren't necessarily tactical just due to the size of the weapons. So a lot of evolution over time on that. And then, so that's kind of what a bomber is and what they do. I think it's also interesting at this point to look at some of the attributes that bombers have. And this has been true through all of history. So it's, the primary thing you're looking at when you assess bomber performance and capabilities, it's what we call range versus payload. And so all aircraft have what's called maximum takeoff weight, which kind of sets what it's able to carry. That's a little bit fuzzy in combat terms because you can overload an airplane and still probably get it off the ground with more risk. But in general, an aircraft can only carry so much, and that includes fuel. So there's almost always a sliding scale on range versus payload. So you can carry quite a large bomb load over a shorter distance, or you can carry more fuel, a smaller bomb load, and go further. So that's obviously a really important one, and that's really what defines the spec when you're designing a new bomber is what kind of a bombs it need to carry and what target do we want to be able to hit from some location you're taking off from. But then there's a lot of secondary aspects to bombers as well that are very important. So speed, we're going to talk quite a bit about that because during the Cold War, especially the early Cold War, that really affected the defenses of that a bomber may or may not have. What altitude the aircraft could get to, again, very much related to the defensive aspects. Then you also have bomb sights are evolving. So what kind of technology are you using to actually put the bombs on your target, and how good is that? And then I would say the final one, kind of on the bomb side of things, is payload shape is somewhat important as well, especially early in the Cold War. The early nuclear bombs were quite large and quite heavy, and they wouldn't just go in any bomber. You had to have a bomb bay big enough to fit that payload. And then you can also talk about some of like the earthquake bombs that like Great Britain had that were very long, and like even in World War II, a lot of American bombers couldn't carry those because our bomb bays just weren't big enough. Designing your airplane around payload shape ends up at some point becoming important as well. And then defensive features, we'll talk some about that. What kind of guns or electronic features do you have to defend yourself? And then the final big one also is takeoff constraints. So what kind of a runway do you need at gross weight to be able to take off on? And does it have to be a paved runway, or can it be a unimproved strip somewhere backcountry in Europe because that's where the war front has gone to or whatever? So a lot of things to think about when you evaluate a bomber when you come up with a new bomber design.
Well, we talked about the shift in definitions, and I think we've got to talk about the biggest influence, which is the nuclear weapons themselves. So how quickly did nuclear bombs change what bombers were expected to do? How did things like yield, accuracy, and weapon size drive aircraft design through the late 1940s and 1950s, and indeed onwards?
Yeah, it's another fascinating thing to look at in reference to time in the Cold War, because nothing in the Cold War is static, and certain things, and this is a big one of them, changed extremely rapidly. Really, the first 10 to 15 years after World War II, the nuclear weapon development was just gangbusters, and less so after that, but it still was to be refined. So right at the end of the war, there was a small number of even aircraft that were capable of nuclear delivery, a small number of B-29s, which was fine because at the time we had virtually no excess bombs, nor did we really have any to put them, not that we wanted to, but but that quickly evolved, as soon as the Cold War started heating up, and as soon as we were pretty sure that the Soviets were working on their own bomb, that went from a small handful of aircraft to like 200 aircraft, I think by 1948, were nuclear capable. At that point, mostly B-50s and B-36s. But so, that's evolving quickly. I find just looking at the numbers of nuclear weapons fascinating, and everybody knows it in rough terms, but it's until you really think about the numbers, it's sort of mind-blowing. So it's a point of comparison. So in World War II, a typical large bomber raid, so think like the 1,000 bomber raids and some of those, that was a total tonnage drop of a few kilotons, something like that. Maybe 3 or 4 on some of those really biggest raids. So the atomic bombs dropped in Japan, the first one in Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. So, and the second at Nagasaki was 21 kilotons. So each of those two bombs was, like 4 or 5,000 bomber raids of World War II.
Goodness.
So it's almost mind blowing what one all of a sudden do. And that's your first gen atomic. When you get to the hydrogen bomb, which is a more advanced bomb that uses a fusion reaction, those tend to get into the megaton class, and a megaton is 1,000 kilotons. So you hear those numbers and they just don't really make sense until you compare them. So as a comparison, 3 megatons is roughly all of the bombs dropped in Europe in World War II. So you now have one bomb that can do every bombing mission in Europe in World War II by a single bomb, a single airplane on a single night. It's just mind-blowing. And then you take that to its extreme. The largest bomb ever detonated was by Russia, called Tsar Bomba. It was 50 megaton. So a whole nother order of magnitude larger. It's just, and that was never a practical weapon. And once that actually happened, the whole world kind of said, okay, enough's enough.
Yeah.
Cut back on size here and focus on quantity, which I'm not sure that was actually a good.
Well, yeah.
So right, but so these numbers are just mind-boggling. And then so one hydrogen bomb can replace all bombs in World War II in Europe. And a modern bomber, you talk about a B-52 or B-1, you can carry like 20 cruise missiles, each one of those with a hydrogen bomb warhead on it. So and they can go attack multiple targets. Same with the missiles. The multiple reentry vehicles will have 5 or more independent warheads that it can then, once it, kind of up in space, disconnects from the shell that it's in, they can go down and hit separate cities. And yeah, it's mind-boggling. So
That's crazy. Yeah.
So that's on the one side. That's on the how big are these and how big are they getting? They also at the same time are getting smaller. So the yield is going through the roof, but then the size, the physical size and the weight of the bombs is getting way, way smaller. So just through, first gen of anything is what it is. And then you go learn more and you do more and you can get them smaller and more effective. So in the first 10 years after World War II, bombs go from a 10,000 pound, kind of minimum size, which was kind of limiting for anything small, down to as small as 1,000 pounds. So you can get an atomic bomb now that's 1,000 pounds. Almost any airplane can carry that. Yeah, at the same time, they're getting 2,000 times more yield and 10 times less weight. So yeah, that too is just a fascinating story, a fascinating thing to think about.
Yeah.
And then so, you also kind of have to question also, like, do you really need that much power? Like, if you can already take out a city with a kiloton sized weapon, you really need a megaton.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
The Gen Zero Cold War bombers were really post-war derivatives. For the most part, they weren't new aircraft, and most of them were already somewhat in development during the war. So, and there are a couple reasons for that. First of all, right at the end of the war, there's kind of a big lull, right? Like all air forces around the world were demobbing at a massive rate. Most like RAF, USAF, were all shrinking in size by like up to 80%. So just massive reductions. Airplanes were getting, sent to the boneyards and so forth. There was very little military budget for expanding. Most of the countries thought the next war was many years away, maybe as much as 10 years away, right? Which was kind of a semi-realistic thing to look at, given how awful World War II was. America had the nuclear monopoly. So I don't think immediately after the war, we were too worried about, the Soviets attacking us. Certainly that was coming, and there was a lot of fear of what's coming next. But at the very moment, there wasn't too much to worry about. Aircraft manufacturers were eager to stay relevant, and they were very hungry, trying to keep their doors open, trying to keep their good people employed. And so they were very much working on jet development, but that was a slow process, and it was going to be 3 or 4 years before the real practical jet bombers came about. So basically, yeah, right after the war, you do have some new models that come out, which we'll talk about here in slightly more detail. But for the most part, they were modified existing designs, didn't really have all that much more performance other than range increases. So they basically got heavier. They took advantage of larger engines that were available, and so could therefore either carry slightly higher bomb load, but more importantly, had more range. And I think that was mostly driven by what's the next threat. Once Germany is conquered, probably Soviets are next. Well, Soviets is further east, and so we've got to have these airplanes. If there's going to be any kind of war there, have more range to be able to get there. It's not just flying to Berlin anymore. So the couple key aircraft during this time. So the Avro Lincoln was an updated Lancaster. It ended up being a more substantial upgrade. It wasn't just a re-engineering. It did have a whole new wing, a larger wing that really gave it a lot more capability. And so about 20% more payload and more range capability. It could just barely reach Moscow, so it really wasn't a practical Moscow bomber. It would have a very small payload to get there, but it was like the best you could do at the time with the engines that were available and so forth. So the B-29 is kind of interesting because it was I guess one of the things we'll talk about here is almost all these bombers we're going to talk about never saw any combat action, or if they did, it was really, really minor. A few sorties at some little regional conflict or something like that. But the two exceptions are the B-29 significant sorties in the Korean War, and the B-52, of course, saw extensive use in Vietnam. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But the B-29 experience in Korea was pretty interesting. The B-29s that were used, not the B-50. The 29s were World War II aircraft that were still around. So 21,000 sorties flown, which compared to World War II, pretty low number, but still a lot of sorties flown. Of those, there was only 34 losses total in the whole war, which is a much, much, much better success rate than what World War II saw. And it was a combination of things. So it was mostly night bombing to basically have more protection from enemy fighters. Those airplanes would have been pretty vulnerable during the day, given jet fighters that were available. Luckily for America, the North Vietnamese did not have a fighter at the time that had radar on it. So they didn't have a night fighter, essentially. So there was about 16 kills to fighters, but pretty low in the number of sorties. And then the other advantage is the B-29 being pressurized, it'll fly high enough that ground fire, what we call flak in World War II, can't really, at least at this time, couldn't really get up to the altitudes the B-29s were flying at. So the flak defenses, or the AAA, as it later became called, anti-aircraft artillery, were not very effective against B-29s in that era. So I think those two things combined are really why the losses in Korea were relatively low. All that's going to change here in a few more years once missiles come out, once fighters get attack radar, so they can fight at night and so forth. But there was a little sweet spot in there. Again, back to the nothing is static in the Cold War. Everything is different. So that's kind of the B-29 story. I guess one other sort of interesting thing, there's the tactics. So because of the mass bombing of cities in World War II and the public kind of pushback against that, the Korean War very much started of, we're not doing that. We're just going after tactical military targets, and the mission planners pretty much held to that for the first couple of years. Toward the end of the war, however, as the war was somewhat stalemating again, the planners basically said, forget that, we got to end this war. And so they basically switched to firebombing of North Korean cities, much like we did in Japan at the end of the war. And at the end of the war, in late 53, whenever that was, there was like massive damage to almost every North Korean city because of that. But that's really the last time in history that that's happened, because once again, there was outcry of like, you can't do this anymore. And in Vietnam, there certainly was civilian casualties, but not on the same level from that kind of lesson reinforced. So the B-50 was out at this time as well. It was really just an upgraded B-29 with bigger engines, better electronics. Some of the systems were upgraded as well, but the same basic airframe. Could carry a little more bomb load, a little more range, could carry more fuel, and so forth. But yeah, it really wasn't a step change in aircraft design. They were not using Korea at all because these were most of the aircraft that were then being converted to being the nuclear delivery force. And so they didn't want to risk those airplanes, and we still had a lot of B-29s, which for conventional bombing, worked just fine. So, so that's the B-50. Then the other big one in this era is the V-36. So this was an aircraft that was actually conceived early in World War II. So in the 1941 is really when the development of this aircraft started. And it really got greenlit because of Hitler's sweep across Europe and the fear that, after Dunkirk, the fear that, is England next? If England gets invaded and there's no longer a base there, then we need to figure out how to go attack Germany from probably American soil, or at least somewhere much further away than England. So that was really the impetus of the B-36. So very similar aircraft in a mission kind of design aspect, tactical idea as the B-29, just much larger and much heavier and much greater range because of that. So the B-36 is twice as heavy as a B-29 and 4 times as heavy as a Lancaster. So it's a massively big.
It's huge, yeah.
Almost the weight of a B-52, that replaced it essentially. Yeah, so a very large aircraft. The original goal was to be able to bomb Germany from America with a 20,000 pound bomb load or something like that. It didn't end up being able to do that. I think it probably could hit Europe from America with a much smaller bomb load, and then later upgrades push that range up some more and so forth. But that was its design goal. Once again, one of these bombers never actually dropped bombs in combat. Again, mostly because it was relegated to the nuclear deployment mission. And if you're not fighting World War III, then those bombers don't really get used. Yeah. So, but also because of its movement dimension, it could carry 70,000 pounds of bombs, not at intercontinental range, but it had, massive bomb load capacity compared to anything that come before. And because of that, the very first hydrogen bombs we were just talking about, the very first those were heavy. They were 30 or 40,000 pound bombs. So for about a 5 or more year period, this B-36 was the only airplane that could carry those until the B-52 came around. So this airplane stayed in service probably a lot longer than it should have, because on every other level it was very outdated. But given its payload and mission capabilities, it was all it was for those larger bombs.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of jets, they are the peak of modernity and tech. They are the future. But early jet bombers often struggled with range, reliability, and also practicality as well. And that raises a question of why did the first generation of jet bombers underperform expectations, and what did aircraft like the B-45, the Canberra get right despite those limitations?
Yeah, so I think this kind of comes back to the statement I made earlier about the very first atomic bomb. You learn a lot from the first gen of anything that you built, and jet bombers were absolutely in this case. And not only was it the bomber, but it was also, remember, in this time, so this is late 40s, right after World War II, jet engines were still in their infancy. Every year that went by, jet engines were gaining thrust for a given size, getting lighter for the given amount of thrust, and they were getting more reliable, and they were burning less fuel. And so the very first generation of jet bombers that came about were based on the pretty early generation engines, which were not very good by today's standards. And that's another interesting thing to think about here. This is going to be another recurring theme here, is all these things we're talking about, whether it's first jets, first bombs, first jet engines, first missiles. We have hindsight now, 40 some years later, and say, oh yeah, back then, man, that was crap, right? Like, I can't believe how bad it was. In that day, though, this was the future. This was you didn't know any better, right? And so, today, would we skip this first gen of bombers because in general they just weren't very good? Probably, if we knew what was coming 5 years later. But at the time, you don't know that. And this is what you got to do to survive and to push forward. So the first gen of bombers was really technologically not much different than the airplanes we were just talking about, the evolution of the World War II bomber. So the straight wings, the aerodynamics, the materials of the bombers were made out of, the bomb sights, the electronics, all of that really was no better, maybe slightly better, but not much than what came before. The only real difference was you're now sticking jet engines on them or in them instead of a big piston engine. And so the plus side of this, which is huge, is you're like doubling the cruise speed of the airplane. So mid 400 mile per hour cruise speed of this first gen was real, and it was great, and it made them much less vulnerable to fighter attacks when you're going up against a jet fighter. Not immune to it, but you could better hold your own if you were closer to speed. So that's the plus side. Everything else about them gets worse. So the jet engines essentially burn so much fuel compared to the early ones, compared to a piston engine. Yeah, you might double the speed, but you're probably going to cut either your range or your payload or both in half. And so whatever you could do previously, you could fly 2,000 miles with an airplane of this size or whatever. All of a sudden you put jet engines on it. Yeah, you go 400 miles per hour, but now you're only flying 1,000 miles. And that's just the reality of it. So the other big problem with them is takeoff performance. So jet engines don't make near as much what's called static thrust, or the thrust when you sitting on the runway and first power up, as compared to a big propeller and a multi-thousand horsepower engine. And so takeoff distances went way up. And so now you're talking about having to extend runways on airports, or maybe build new airports in order just for these airplanes to get off the ground. And then the final one was just those early engines were nowhere near the reliability of modern engines, or even engines 10 years later, as well as, and partially because of that reliability, they also required a massive amount of maintenance. So an engine coming out of the airplane every 100 or 200 hours was common back then, whereas nowadays you can get a jet engine will last thousands of hours before it needs to have anything seriously done to it. So the resources it took to keep these engines, or these aircraft and engines, in the air was pretty massive. But again, at the time, it's all there was, and it definitely was the future. And so, countries were building these and trying to stay ahead of the race. So a couple of bombers we can talk about here in this era. There's kind of, 2 or 3 that really stand out. So America's first bomber, jet bomber, was the B-45. This came out of a program, right, kind of in the mid to late 40s, 46 or 47, I think, where the Air Force put out a competition that said, hey, we want to get a jet bomber. All you companies that think you can do this, submit a bid, and we'll greenlight some of them. We'll see how that turns out. So 4 different companies proposed a prototype. 2 of them went in production. So B-45 was one of them, and B-47 was another. B-47 really falls into the next category we're going to talk about. So pause on that for the moment. But
Hmm.
B-45 was the straight wing, kind of low technology, low risk aircraft that got greenlit at that time. And so it was okay. It could basically carry 10,000 pounds of bombs, but only 750 miles. So kind of, not much more than what like a V-17 could do, other than would do it twice as fast. Could carry more, I think up to 20,000 pounds, but at a much shorter range. So yeah, not a super useful bomber at the time. Limited use in Korea in all those shortcomings, the short range, the small payload. It was expensive. The maintenance, all of that was hard. So it got used just a little bit in Korea, but barely. Kind of a interesting side note, it did actually get deployed in Great Britain in the early 50s once the Cold War was really heating up, the arms race was heating up, and there was just a need for weaning deployable nuclear weapons near the Soviet Union, and we need them now. And so even though it wasn't a great airplane, there was, I don't remember how many, but dozens of them in Great Britain for like 5 years in that role. And then, very quickly, once better airplanes came online, it got retired. The next airplane, which is kind of similar, but also very much not, and was much more successful, is the English electric Canberra bomber, the British design. Lot of people love this airplane, myself included. Great airplane.
And me, yeah.
There you go. It's still funny, when I was really starting to dig into this, I've got this big database of aircraft with all the specs and stuff, and it allows me to plot things and look for trends and stuff like that. So I'd never paid all that much attention to this aircraft. Kind of knew what it was. Was always a fan of it, but like really never dug into the numbers. And so I started looking at it, and it's kind of an outlier. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, this thing is like the modern Mosquito. It's like, it's kind of a bomber, but it's got a big wing, so it's super maneuverable, and it's
that's true. Yeah,
high speed, and it's like, it's just like a Mosquito. And then I got reading some of its history, and sure enough, it was literally designed to be a Mosquito replacement. So interested that the numbers really, showed that out without me not even knowing that history. Again, not a whole lot different than like what a World War II bomber could do, just twice as fast. But that low wing loading, that more maneuverability, it just gave it more capability, as far as being able to pull off evasive maneuvers. It was a very good recce airplane. Yeah, great airplane, was around for a lot of years. And I think another point of this airplane that I think really tells its story well is America actually bought these, or bought the rights to it, I guess I should say, as the B-57. And so essentially the same airplane. We did put an American engine in it because we're Americans, and some upgraded avionics and a few things, but it was very much a British design that we built in the late 40s and early 50s. And that's an exception. There's very few foreign aircraft that U.S. Armed Services will buy. And I mean, it's like I say, it's a perfect testament to how good this was and how much better it was than anything else we had at the time. And they did see some use then in Vietnam because of that, as more of a tactical bomber because of its shorter range than what like a B-52 could do. And then the UK, they were used a little bit in a few, like Suez Crisis. Say we used them in Vietnam. Kind of an interesting fact, and this pops up every once in a while on all aircraft or many aircraft. They were actually used against the UK in the Falklands War, so they were an enemy airplane at that point. So a few sorties flown there. And yeah, I think the last one of these retired in like 2006. That was a bomb ready for, but very long lifespan.
Long service, yeah.
How good of an airplane it was. And then the last one we should mention here, because we're going to throw in some Soviet aircraft throughout this as well. I should have mentioned earlier, so in that first gen, Soviets never really had a tactical or a strategic bomber during World War II. At the end of the war, they had in their possession, I think, 4 B-29s that were ours, that we landed in Soviet Union for whatever reason. They kept them, reverse engineered them, and built an airplane they called the Tu-4, the Tupolev 4, which was basically an exact carbon copy of the B-29. So that was by essentially stealing and reverse engineering that design was their only way of delivering, the early atomic bombs that they built until they could catch up in the jet era. So this next one, the Ilyushin IL-28 Beagle, was their first jet bomber, very similar to the two aircraft we just discussed. So it was kind of somewhere between a Canberra and a B-45. 45. One of the interesting things about it is, it's the highest production Cold War bomber of any, and by a lot. I think 6,000 of them were built.
Oh,
By the time you get to the Cold War, that's a very big number.
yeah.
Most of them, especially the big bombers, there's like hundreds built and maybe 1,000 or 1,500 or something. So the fact that they produced 6,000 of these is pretty remarkable. And part of that was they exported these to a whole lot of countries. So a lot of African countries, pretty much anywhere under the Soviet umbrella, had IL-28s at some point. China had them. I think China was building their own on the same copies. So all of that is why there were so many of them built. But still, it was not a great bomber. But for its time, it held with the rest of them, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So we talked about the early bombers coming through here, but by the mid-1950s, things start to feel more settled. You've got the swept wings, better engines, smaller nuclear weapons, and proper all-weather bombing systems. Is this a point where the Cold War bomber really comes into its own with aircraft like the V-bombers, the B-47, Tu-16, and ultimately the B-52?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you just nailed it there. This is where the real Cold War bomber, as we know it, really comes into it. It's really diverging from anything that existed before, and the performance and everything we think of when we think of a Cold War bomber. This is really, really where it's at. And so, like, those last two bombers, everybody knows what a Canberra is. Most people never even heard of a B-45, right? Like, it's just one of those bombers that's just, unless you're a real airplane nerd, it's just sort of lost to history. Same with the IL-28. Like, it's not. Whereas B-52, B-bombers, even B-47, like, everybody knows what those are. And yeah, now fast forward to the 50s, these, several of these had their inception in the 40s still. So they were not that far after the end of the war. But that's another big change in this period, is the systems and the engines and the aero and everything else in these aircraft are getting so much more complicated that the development time it takes to build a new aircraft is like 2 or 3 times longer than it was in World War II. In the previous decade, it was not unheard of to come up with a spec of an airplane and have it in the air like a year later, and probably fighting maybe a year after that or 2 years after that at the most. And now we're talking about development cycles that are probably 3 years to get to first flight, and then maybe another, depending on how it goes, another 3 or 4 years before it's operational because of all the problems it has and things you have to fix. So these airplanes really started in the 40s, late 40s, but most of them didn't come into service until mid 50s. So, and there's a lot of, budgets were through the roof now, because now we are in the Cold War for real. The arms race is absolutely happening. It's happening now. Essentially, this was all performance increase in every front. So engines continue to evolve. Engines got much better in this period, more reliable, higher thrust for weight and for size. Cruise speeds, we already were at mid 400s. Now we're up to mid 500s, even pushing 600 miles per hour of these bombers. Effective range goes up. We didn't mention earlier, aerial refueling really came about the generation before. So some of those, certainly the first gen jets, but also those B-29s, B-50s, and so forth could do aerial refueling. So now all of a sudden you can get more range without having to completely redesign the airplane. It's not as practical as having the range to begin with, but the need for more missions for sure. But at this era, you're no longer talking about 800 or 1,000 mile combat radius. Some of these airplanes are getting up to 4,000 mile as a jet, which is absolutely huge. It really makes bombing, as we kind of learn to know it, or the threat of that in the Cold War was now possible with some of these aircraft. So the big change probably in this period that really drove everything else was swept wings. So when you sweep an airplane wing, you raise what's called a Mach divergent drag value. So you can push closer to the speed of sound without this like massive drag increase that happens. It just kind of is like a speed break that prevents the bomber from flying any faster. So swept wings themselves it just make that possible. The Germans knew this. They didn't really have a practical, highly swept wing bomber. I shouldn't say not really. They didn't at all in the war. Me-262 had mild sweep, but not enough to really make a difference here. But they were very much studying it. So they had a wind tunnel facility, a research facility called Vulcanroad near Braunschweig that had massive development capabilities, supersonic, hypersonic wind tunnels. It was an amazing place. The Allies, so both the British and the Americans, were in that facility before the war was even over. and were basically learning some of these things. And some of that data back to Boeing, but Boeing's chief engineer was on that visit before the war was even over. And he sent a memo home and to the team working on the B-47 at the time, the early stages, and said, stop what you're doing. We need a new wing. It's got to be swept. Here are some sketches. I'll be home in a month. This is the direction we're going. So the B-47 was very fortunate from a timing perspective to have that knowledge transfer right at the right time. And so it was the first swept wing bomber. And then there were many more to come, including the B-bombers and B-52 and so forth. But it was right in that crucial time period that evolved. And the hard thing about swept wings, so designing a swept wing is not hard. It's from okay, we'll just make it a different angle. And, what's hard about that? And from a high speed standpoint, it is almost that simple. The problem is everything you do on a swept wing to make it go fast makes low speed much, much harder. So just getting the airplane to stall correctly, to be controllable at low speeds and so forth gets really hard on a swept wing. So even though it looks simple, the follow-on effects it has on an airplane are pretty massive. And a lot of the early airplanes really struggle with some stuff on that, which is why several of them, almost all of them, took several years longer to come into service than was originally planned. So a couple other things that are evolving at this time that are kind of interesting. Crew survivability is one that fascinates me. So this is of the era, for whatever reason, I've never really been able to track down like how this started to happen, but the value of human life starts to evolve at this point. In World War II, and I think it was just because of everyone was so desensitized to killing. People were somewhat thought to almost be expendable, right? And so in the 50s is really when you start to get a lot of attention, not just in aviation, but everywhere. In car safety, when seatbelts started to come around. But some of these ideas, crashworthiness of cars, ejection seats in airplanes, motor racing, starting to, back in the day, race car drivers get killed almost every race, it seems like. And then all of a sudden there's this whole new, that's not okay anymore. We need to change this. So ejection seats started to come into airplanes because it's, crew survivability all of a sudden became really important. And then there was a stage that most of these airplanes went through at first because the early ejection seats weren't great. They were looking at escape capsules where the whole cockpit area, the whole thing would come out of the airplane in one shot. The whole crew would be together in this massive parachute. And that ended up staying in a few airplanes like the B-1 bomber and the first version, the B-1 and the F-111 both had escape capsules like that. So in the end, neither of those had a massive effect on the airplane designs, but it's when it starts to come in. It's just one more example of change that's coming in. As you mentioned, bombs are getting smaller, so there's a lot less demand on the size of the payload bay that you have to have. And that took a while for that to fully get realized. But the smaller the lighter blocks, a lot of effect on the missions. And then probably the last one in this category is the bombing technology. So we had radar bomb sights, of course, the event end of World War II, the H-2S, which was a game changer, especially for night bombing. All of a sudden, and above weather, being able to see through clouds and see a coastline and say, okay, I know I see this coastline and this harbor shape, so I know the city is here and so forth. That said, those early versions were pretty crude. They were low resolution. They didn't have enough ability to really pick out fine details that you needed to be accurate if you didn't have a coastline or something. So in this era, that technology just continues to evolve. The resolution goes up, the ability to discern different features goes way up. And because of that, bombing accuracy doesn't instantly change, but it just keeps getting better to the point, 20 years later, it's very accurate. So this is the heyday of the V-bomber. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. Such a fascinating story. So I was just talking about the bomber competition that America had in the mid 40s. Great Britain went through the same thing. And so in 47, the government put out a request for, hey, all you aircraft companies, we need a new bomber. It needs to be 50,000 foot ceiling, 600 miles an hour, or better, and be able to drop a 10,000 pound bomb on Moscow or further if possible. And so it's essentially factored around trying to get of the day, the technology of an atomic bomb on Moscow and have enough height and enough speed that it has a reasonable chance of surviving. So four companies put in an offer with a design. They're all very different designs. So ultimately the down select went down to what became the Vulcan and what became the Victor. So the Avro Vulcan and the Handley Page Victor. And then we kind of right at the last minute, they said, oh, the Valiant, that one is simpler, lower risk. let's order that too, just as a backup. In case the other two fail miserably, and it'll probably be ready sooner, so we can help fill a gap until those other two get there. So all three of those went into production. All swept wings, all of the similar technology, but kind of, I guess I should say. So the Valiant was pretty traditional. Again, it did have a swept wing. There were some unknowns there, but nothing all that radical about its aero. And because of that, it was the lesser performing of the three, but not by a whole lot. It was the lighter of the three, so it just didn't quite have the performance, the capabilities that the other two had. But it was also the first to fly, first to be operational. So it could just barely meet the mission of 10,000 pounds hitting Moscow. I think there's questions in real battlefield conditions would have actually gotten there or not, but it theoretically could. Thankfully, it never had to. So, and so overall, its ability to carry a bomb in its range was similar to a B-29, but again, it was 2 times faster. But again, for the day, a bomber to be able to do that was remarkable, because the first time you meet what a B-29 could do. So, pretty interesting history. It was the first aircraft to drop UK atomic bomb and the first to drop a hydrogen bomb, both practice or test missions, of course, never drop one in anger. And it served its purposes pretty well early on, when it was the first there. The kind of the sad note of this bomber's history, we're going to talk more in a bit about missile defenses and how that really changed bomber tactics. So this one was very much hit by that. In the mid to late 50s, when surface air missiles came on board, bombers were pretty vulnerable, or at least they were thought to be. And so that kind of changed tactics to what was called a high-low-high mission, where essentially the bombers needed to fly high to get the range they needed, because up in the thin atmosphere, that's what you got to do in a jet if you want to go long range. But you're vulnerable to surface air missiles up there. So then the idea was, okay, well, you're probably only over that zone for a short amount of time. So in that case, fly down low. If you're down low to the ground, the enemy radar is probably not going to pick you up in the same way that you can if you're up at 40 or 50,000 feet. And so you're just screaming along low, flying right over those missile sites before they can even see you're there and react and shoot you down. The problem is when you're flying down low, especially at high speed, atmospheric turbulence is a killer. It's way lower at low altitude than it is at high altitude. So you're flying low, you're just getting hammered by that. And unfortunately, these early planes were not designed for that. So there were several Valiants that were lost. Well, I think there was only one that was actually lost in flight due to the wing breaking. And there was another one, basically the wing broke in flight, but they were able to get it safely on the ground. But essentially in these, they were never flying these missions for real, but they were practicing them. And they were spending so much time at high speed, low altitude. The airplanes were just taking so much punishment. They were getting metal fatigue that was not sustainable. So at the end, it was deemed too expensive to fix that on these Valiants. So they essentially just retired them early, which again is sad, because I think it would have had a much longer career in other aspects had they not all essentially been used up by that change of tactics. And at the time this happened, the Vulcan and the Victors were on board, and the possible end of the bomber's future was already kind of starting to look like that might be in sight with ballistic missiles coming online. So I don't think it was much of a hard choice to retire these. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of the value in a nutshell. Vulcan, probably one of my top 5 airplanes in the world. I absolutely love the Vulcan. Everything about it. It's such a cool airplane.
That's so cool, yeah.
I love flying wings. That is very much that. And it's probably the best flying wing as far as a practical airplane with a heck of a service life that's ever been built. So really, really cool airplane. So it had a little more capability than Valiant. It could do 20,000 pounds to Moscow reliably. Like, I don't know if there's any question that it could get there and back with a higher wing load. And the other kind of magical thing about the Vulcan, so it also was flying these low-level missions after the ground-to-air missile threat evolved. But because of its wing shape, it basically had just a much stronger structure because of that big wing that was so thick. And so it was less susceptible to fatigue damage. So even though it was flying those same missions, it didn't have the same problem. And so it had a much longer life because of that. And yeah, eventually carried air-to-surface missiles. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Probably, I'm sure everybody knows this story, but the probably the most famous mission of all, or missions, I should say, it was more than one of them, were the Black Buck missions during Falklands War.
Oh, yeah.
The final kind of missions or useful life of the Vulcan. It was retired very soon after that. But at the time, they were taking off from was it Ascension Island, I think, in the middle of the Atlantic, flying 4,000 miles to drop those bombs in the Falklands, which at the time was by far the longest bombing raid ever in history.
Yeah,
it has been.
That's incredible. Yeah.
But is incredible. The interesting part of that is it was such, the Vulcan had nowhere near that range. So it had to be refueled, and not only refueled, but refueled over the middle of the Atlantic where there's no air bases. There's no easy way to do that. So there was a whole fleet of Victor tankers that were flown. And for that very first mission, I think it was one Victor that, made it there and back. There was one backup aircraft as well, but it took 11 tankers to fly that mission. So yeah, if you want to see more about this, like just Google this. There's some diagrams of how this works. So you have Victors refueling other Victors and then peeling off and going home, and like that happening like 3 times in a row to get that airplane there and back. And then you had to do it on the way home as well. So it's fascinating.
It's just incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. But they worked. It was a successful mission, and then they did several more of them. So pretty cool. But yeah, love a Victor. Retired in 1984. So pretty long life for, how it started and how early a lot of the tech on that airplane was. So then the final one here in this category, should say the final British one, the Victor. I also love a Victor. First time I saw one was probably 10 years ago at Duxford. They had it outside at the time, and it was like this foggy day, and just like walking up and seeing that nose like come out of the fog, I will never forget.
Wow.
It was just wild. And just, yeah, it was a great airplane. Aerodynamically, just an amazing airplane, especially for its time. But also just the style of that airplane. It's like nothing else looks like it. It's looks like something out of Star Wars.
It does, yeah.
Fabulous. So in some ways, it was probably the most successful of the three as far as performance goes. So it could take 35,000 pounds to Moscow. It was a heavier airplane, so it was pushing the weight boundary. Really, really revolutionary wing design, especially for its time. I called the crescent wing. So the folks at Henry Page were really focused on solving that problem I was talking about. How do you make a high-speed wing that also has good low-speed handling qualities? And in the end, they got that very right. Both of these airplanes, actually, all three of these had embedded engines in the wing, which was very much the style of the day. It was a great way. The engines were relatively small in diameter for a bomber. And so you could cut down on drag and just make a very clean design. For its time, it was a very, very advanced wing design. A lot of development work went into that. The aircraft initially, so it goes into operation a little bit later. It was a little bit slower to get all those bugs worked out. So 58. By this time, the missile threat is nearly upon us. Another changing tactic was to start to use air-launched cruise missiles, essentially. But the Victor, really, by the time it entered service, it was mostly designed to carry those cruise missiles. And the advantage of those is this is another defensive tactic in a way, is if you can launch a missile at least 100 miles and sometimes hundreds of miles away from your target, you don't have to physically get as close as the bomber. And so all those missile defenses and gun defenses that are nearby a big city, for instance, you can launch your missile and get out before you get anywhere near there. So that's really kind of what it was looking like as its operational stage, when it was a bomber. I think it didn't spend as much time at the low-level mission as the Valiant. I think by the time the Victor got there, partially because it was carrying the missiles, but also it was a little bit behind. I think a lot of those lessons have been learned by the Valiant, so they basically didn't subject it to that same mission. But it also meant it retired early because at some point it was not a defensible weapon. But they figured out it would make a great tanker, and it's had probably an even longer life as a very successful aerial refueling aircraft than it as a bomber. So kind of a neat tale. Then the final one here, the B-47, kind of already talked about it. The first evolution of a swept wing jet based on the German technology that was grabbed at the end of the war. Somewhat different layout than the other two aircraft we just talked about. The swept wing, probably the biggest difference is that Boeing decided not to put the engines in the wing, but put them on pods below the wing. And so that really changed a lot of other things on the airplane. The wing ended up being really thin because of that for lower drag. You couldn't put the gear in the wing anymore, so you had to put the gear in the fuselage. And unfortunately, gear and bombs tend to want to be at the same position, basically where the center of gravity of the airplane's at. So now all of a sudden, okay, we put landing gear and the fuselage where the bombs go. So they came up with this unique bicycle gear design where you've got not one main set of gear, but you've got gear at the very front and gear at the very back. And you've got this massive bomb bay in between, which worked out pretty well, as what they essentially copied for the B-20 or B-52. Very, very similar layout, just larger and more engines. Similar performance to like the B-29, kind of similar to what we were talking about. So something like 10 or 15,000 pounds would get there from England to Moscow at double the speed of a B-29, half the mission time, so it flies fast, but also double the fuel. So more expensive to operate. Not that anybody really cared about that at the time. And I don't know, I would say it was an okay aircraft. It had reliability issues. It really, I view its biggest benefit was it was sort of a Gen 1 B-52. And when you go start over to B-52, you've got so many lessons learned. You can have a really good B-52 based on what you learned from this. Just like if Great Britain had stayed in the strategic or the heavy bomber field and they had did an upgraded Victor clean sheet or an updated Vulcan clean sheet, holy cow, those two could have been really good airplanes. But that's not where not where the politics or the decisions went. So
so surface-to-air missiles arrive, resulting in bomber tactics changing dramatically and standoff weapons start to appear. How did SAMs, ECMs, and air-launched nuclear missiles alter bomber survivability, and how did different countries respond to that threat? I also want to ask, and we've got to mention two aircraft in particular here that just refused to disappear, which is the B-52 and the Tu-95. Both first flew in the early 1950s and both still operational today. What did their designs get so right that these aircraft outlive faster, newer, and more advanced alternatives?
Yeah, great questions. And this, so starting with the changing tactics, changing defenses, and so forth is really a fascinating period of change. And like I said earlier, this didn't come about until mid to late 50s. So almost middle of the Cold War is when really some of this stuff started heating up. I'd say the first one I'll talk about real quickly is gun armament on bombers went through a big change here. So, of course, in World War II, you had guns all over the place. All the bombers we just talked about, America still held onto the tail gun, thinking you can just fly up behind a bomber at any speed. It's going to be completely vulnerable. Great Britain, all the V bombers we just talked about in the Canberra as well, had no guns on them whatsoever, not even a tail gun. And their theory was, fighters, it's not actually that easy to get on the tail of a bomber if the bomber's going fast, because you got to intercept it, you got to turn around, you got to catch it. And if you're flying almost as fast, it's probably never going to happen. So hard to say how that decision actually would have played out in reality, because there's several examples I'm going to talk about here where the reality actually wasn't as bad as what was feared, right? So in Vietnam, I think there was 2 aircraft shot down by fighters, B-52s total. That was it.
Wow.
Tail gunners also shot down 2 fighters. And so there's not much data there, but you don't really know how to explain that. Was it the enemy feared the tail gun, so they just didn't go after that? Whereas if there was no tail gun, what if you had lots of B-52 shot down? You just don't know, right? And then the other part of this as well is the threat we saw in Vietnam, kind of same as Korea, is probably not the same threat we would have saw if we actually flew into the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had better weaponry, better training, more layers of it. So just because we got away with some things in Vietnam from a defensive standpoint doesn't necessarily mean we were just had free reign on Moscow dropping bombs. Again, these are unanswerable unless you actually go do it. But it's pretty interesting. So the surface air missiles, the other threat, come about in the mid to late 50s, were very much involved in Vietnam. The theory was once you have these missiles, the bomber's just completely vulnerable and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, Vietnam showed that was not true, especially in these early years. I forget how many B-52s were shot down by missiles, but it was 17, I think, which is nothing, right? Out of 100 and some thousand missions, sorties, 17 were shot down by missiles. And it's not that they weren't firing them, but those early missiles, it was like first in of anything, were really bad. They were unreliable. Their tracking systems were bad and so forth. And they were slow enough that the bombers could actually maneuver and avoid them when they saw them coming. Not always, but you could probably more than half of them, they could make a turn or a dive at the last minute and evade them. And then the other big one, probably the biggest of all, was electronic countermeasures. So now you had electronics on board that could jam those missile radars. They couldn't jam the tracking radar. So like the enemy knew you were coming, but then the missiles themselves, the launch stations had their own radar, and they could jam those to where the missile essentially couldn't get a lock on. So that very much worked for a while, but like anything, it's a cat and mouse game. As soon as you bring out that, then they change their radar to where it's not susceptible. Then after some time, you figure that out and have a new ECM system and so forth. So yeah, it's fascinating to see how all that worked. Air-to-air missiles was another thing kind of in the same period. Very little threat in Vietnam, again, because they were brand new. They didn't work very well. And the North Vietnamese didn't necessarily always have them. So would have that been a bigger threat if we had ever went to Russia? Probably. And then, of course, later, this became very real, just like Sam's got a lot more effective in later years as well. So we can talk real quick about, we kind of mentioned it, but air launch nuclear missiles was a big game changer right in this same period. So basically missile technology all evolved at the same time. And once you kind of had missiles that sort of worked, you could use them for anything, whether it's air to ground, ground to air, et cetera. So first gen air to ground missiles, cruise missiles really, were really not very good. Great Britain had one called Blue Steel, not picking on it at all. It's just really early and really crude. His biggest problem was liquid fuel, kind of like a V2 rocket, which meant you couldn't just be sitting on a runway ready to go. You had to fuel it before you launched, which took like 10 minutes or something. And then short range, unreliable, and so forth. Another one called Skybolt, it was unfortunately canceled. It was an American-built rocket that Great Britain was investing in jointly, but got canceled before it ever came to fruition. So a lot going on in that time period that we're trying to keep bombers relevant. But at the end, the ballistic missiles caught up and kind of made the rocket launch cruise missile not needed anymore. So essentially, development stopped on that. So yeah, let's talk about the two. The two longest lived bombers like ever. So the B-52, I guess we kind of already talked about it, an evolution of the B-47. Work on it really began like in 1946. So it was kind of going parallel with the B-47. Goal was 10,000 pound atomic bomb delivered 5,000 miles. Didn't really do that. Actually, toward the end of its re-engineering and getting more efficient, it could kind of almost do that, but the early ones certainly couldn't do that. But they could do 3,000, 3,500. So you could probably bomb Moscow from the far eastern United States or maybe Greenland or somewhere like that. And then with refueling, you could certainly go as long as you wanted to. We already talked about 125,000 sorties in Vietnam. More bomb tons dropped in Vietnam than in World War II, because it was such a more massive bomber. Yeah, so it still is out there today, and I think it's because it was just a really good design. It works. I'm going to say it's cheap. It's not really cheap, but relative to stealth bombers and other modern cheap, it's repairable, and it's just a known entity. And yeah, and then you talk about the Bears, the same thing. They're actually very similar aircraft in a lot of ways. Their capability, their weights, range, payload, all of that, they're very similar aero design and so forth. The big difference, of course, is the Bear is a turboprop, which for whatever reason, Russia chose to and were successful in developing a very large turboprop engine, 15,000 horsepower. All the turboprops that the US and UK were trying to develop at the time were like 3,000 or 4,000 horsepower. So that engine really is what made that airplane capable. And I would say early on, it was more capable of B-52, because at that time, a turboprop was just a better engine for a long-range aircraft. They're more efficient. They have better takeoff performance and so forth. So a remarkable airplane. They're loud. They've got their own issues. But yeah, but it's the same answer. It's a known quantity. They just do the job. And they're efficient, and they're still being flown, and probably will be. I think they're re-engineering the B-52 again right now, and so
really
for another, I don't know how many years. So yeah.
Goodness, I mean, I remember watching a documentary in 2000. It's like it's been in service forever, and that's 26 years ago. And you've just said that they're working on it again. It's just incredible. It says so much, doesn't it, about the aircraft? But we do have to wrap things up. So one last final question. This has been absolutely fascinating. And honestly, this could be a whole podcast series on itself, talking about this. Now, most Cold War bombers never dropped a nuclear bomb in anger. Yet nations spend, the figures, staggering sums maintaining them, building them, etc. So in the end, to sum up, what role did they actually play in winning the Cold War?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think there's a definitive answer to that, but I'll give you my thoughts. I think it comes down to this idea of deterrence, which is essentially it's a perception war, right? Like, what do you think the other side can do? It's like a poker game, right? It's like if you think you know what the other side can do and you think there's a hole that you can exploit, then you then have the upper hand because then you can, and if they know it, then yeah, you can use that politically or influence your power or whatever. So it's the whole Cold War is avoidance of that. It's all about how do we every time some technology changes, how do we come up with a way of saying, oh, that's fine, we can still get our bombers through. We can still get our bombs through, I should say. And so that's really where the triad came from, because any one technology was always going to be changing. You needed backup ways of doing that. You could say okay, once you had missiles, and missiles were pretty hard to defeat, whether they're launching before the enemy comes or they're under the ocean, you don't know where they're at. That's pretty effective. One of the big things that made bombers still relevant, and it's the what's called saber rattling of, you can go put bombers on alert. You can go launch bombers and you can call them back and you can like send a message like, we're serious. Do you really want to do this? Right? You can't do that with an ICBM. There's no such thing as recalling a missile once it's shot. And so you just don't have that tool anymore. Yeah, I just think that the bomber is so core to everything we just talked about, and in some ways still is. I don't know. I think that my favorite part of this, though, when it comes to bombers, though, is that they were there on day one and they're still there. Like they are like the continuity story of the Cold War, unlike anything else. And so, yeah, how much they contribute to winning and were they the thing that won it, I don't think there's an answer to that. But did they play a part? Absolutely.
Well, Joe, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I really want to touch this topic again, and we've got to have you back again. It's a period that is often oversimplified, and you've helped bring a lot of clarity to a very complex subject. And again, it's been great having you on the show. But that is it for this episode of Never Mind the Dambusters. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Cold War bombers, you can find us wherever you find and get your podcasts. Please do subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode. It really does help more people find the show. If you'd like to support the show by helping us continue to produce more content, you can hit the subscribe button in the show notes or go to nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Your contribution helps keep the show on the airwaves. You can also follow us on social media where we post extra photos, background material, and updates on upcoming episodes. So thank you, as ever, for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.